let me start the introduction while the last people come in. Now, today is an important day, as we know. It's all about girl power in Australia with the Matildas. I'd like to say I was clever enough to organise a girl power presentation, but I'm not that clever. It just happened to have worked out that way. So Justin's there, ready to go. And Justin's spent a lot of time in the police force, manager of the Harbourside Local Area Command, so we need to be careful what we say here. He's an active volunteer, particularly with cycling, does some sailing, and has an interest in the history, maritime and naval history. And very importantly, he's a speaker for the National Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour, one of the team of speakers there. And this is one of the presentations he's put together. So with that, Justin, underway, mate.
Well, thank you, Noel, and thank you everybody for coming along this morning to listen to my talk. As Noel says, it is an auspicious occasion in a different sort of way, given what's happening with the Matildas, so entirely appropriate in a way. That the subject of my talk should be about how women came to be in the Royal Australian Navy. So, as you might have guessed from the title, it's a bit of a, from wives and sweethearts to comrades in arms, it's a bit of a doff of the hat to the old naval salute. And of course, it reminds us of a time not so long ago when women were not allowed to work on ships, let alone Navy ships. And my story is about how all that changed as far as the Australian Navy was concerned. So I begin my story in 1997 with the appointment of a young lieutenant, Jennifer Dates, D-A-E-T-Z. I hope I've got that pronunciation correct. And she became the first commander of an RAN ship at sea, HMAS Shepparton, which was a naval survey vessel. Her appointment, of course, represented the culmination of a recruitment process begun back in the dark days of World War II, in 1942, with the creation of the RANS, the Women's Royal Australian Navy Service, and the RANS, the Royal Australian Navy Nursing Service. By the end of World War II, there are about 3,000 women enlisted in these two areas of the RAN. And though they weren't permitted to serve at sea, they nevertheless performed just about every other function that it was possible. Well, not quite, but a variety of other functions that were shore-based, including of radio telegraphists, clerks, cooks, drivers, stewards, as well as nurses, intelligence, cryptanalysis. One of them even was a coast watcher, this lady here, a lady by the name of Ruby Boy, who, with her husband prior to World War II, had been running a timber business up on Vanuatu in the Solomon Islands group. And when war was coming, all the blokes up there, of course, went off to volunteer to fight forces. And Ruby, and that included her husband, and Ruby was left with the local people to run the timber business, and she had to learn how to use the radio. So she taught herself Morse code, and then the Navy back in Australia heard about her existence up there, and she was enlisted in the RANS. They even parachuted in a uniform to her because it was feared if she were caught by the Japanese that she would be summarily executed as a spy. And if it were known to the Japanese that she was a member of the armed forces, she may have been afforded some leniency by virtue of the Geneva Convention. But anyway, fortunately, none of that came to pass. And Ruby survived to a long old age after the war for her services, and was congratulated one day when Bull Halsey, the American admiral, flew in to thank her for her services just before the end of the war. He dropped in on a flying boat. Anyway, enough about Ruby. With the cessation of World War II, not long afterwards, the RANs and the RANs were disbanded because the whole armed forces recruitment effort was scaled down, understandably. But then they realised that, hang on, with the Cold War starting out, they were going to have to start recruiting again, and they decided to reactivate both the RANs and the RANs. So the Royal Australian Navy, the Women's Royal Australian Navy Service, and the RANs, the nursing service, both were operating again by the late 40s, early 50s. 1959, the RANs were made permanent. Previously, they hadn't enjoyed that status. By 1970, there were almost 700 of them working in all 9 RAN shore establishments. Plus, there were some working up in the Navy Communications Detachment in Singapore. And then with the appointment or the election of the Hawke government in 1983, federally, all women were integrated into the RAN permanent, and henceforth there were separate RANs or organisations. They all were just part of the Navy. In 1985, women were allowed to serve at sea for the first time. And by 1990, women were being deployed in combat-related duties to the Middle East, or at least they were being allowed to be deployed to the Middle East. 1992, HMAS Sydney and 1994 HMAS Canberra became the first Australian Navy ships to permanently post women to their ship's complements. And in 1998, approval was given for women to serve on submarines. I think now even the toughest of all naval occupations, that of, well, arguably, the clearance divers has women now as well. That's the short story of how women came to be in the Royal Australian Navy, but the more interesting, well, equally interesting in my view, story about how all this came to pass is what happened before. What were the events that brought all this about? And to find the answers to all those sort of questions, we have to go back rather a long way. So when the Royal Australian Navy was first created in 1911, it was effectively a squadron of the Royal Navy, and as such, it followed very closely the customs and practices of the Royal Navy because of its status as a squadron. And in the First World War, the RENS, the Women's Royal Navy Service, was created in the UK. So the question arises, well, why did the Royal Navy create the RENS? The answer to that, my friends, is, necessity. The Royal Navy had been relying on women unofficially in many capacities for some hundreds of years. And the story of how that came about is what I'll now begin with you. So there's a popular idea, of course, of the sailor's wife and family waiting patiently for him at home. Think about Penelope waiting for her swashbuckling naval husband and hero of the Trojan War, in 10 years to get back across the Aegean. And then, of course, So the idea of families and wives having to wait a long time for their, to be reunited with their spouses is not new. And of course, we're familiar in more recent times with the experience of people like, say, Elizabeth Cook, who was married to James for 17 years and only saw him for about 6 of those 17 years. And then was a widow for about 56 years after he met his untimely death in Hawaii. And we can think of countless other sailor wives who had similar experiences. So for the purpose of our story today, we're talking about the British experience. And as romantic as the notion of waiting patiently at home is to some people, the reality for sailors' wives and families waiting at home was pretty grim, especially if their spouse was the breadwinner and he was in the Royal Navy. Because, among other things, the Jack Tar's pay was pretty basic, and conditions were pretty problematic. There weren't good arrangements for getting pay back to spouses on shore. There was a lot of inflation happening in the UK at the time, especially in the 18th century, when Britain was increasing its power and the size of its navy, and being stretched more and more to fulfil its defence obligations. And at that era in particular, when ships came into shore to revictual, commanders invariably refused to allow crews to go ashore because on any sort of furlough, because of the fear of them deserting, especially during the Napoleonic Wars, which made it difficult for marital relations to continue. There's also the possibility that the spouse might have been pressed into service. The height of the Napoleonic Wars, something like 50% of the sailors on board warships had been press ganged into service. So it was a very common experience. And of course, you'd be saying goodbye to your hubby as he left the threshold in the morning to go off to the local lumberyard or whatever job he was doing, in the waterfront, and then you never hear from him for a couple of years. He was, I don't know, fighting over in Egypt or off the coast of Spain. And of course, there's always the possibility that your spouse could be killed or seriously wounded in battle, so you wouldn't get him back in one piece if you got him back at all. All these sorts of possibilities had huge consequences for families back home. And in terms of safety nets, well, not much in those days. Unlike the social security arrangements we have today, the best you could hope for in those days, if you suddenly became widowed or your spouse was seriously incapacitated, was probably the workhouse. If you had to try and get some income from somewhere, the workhouses were pretty terrible, especially for young families. I mean, the mortality rate for infants in review that was done towards the end of the 18th century discovered that something like only 7% of infants under the age of 12 months made it out of the workhouse. So not a place that you'd want to end up. If you were as a woman, a married woman found to be without visible means of support at that time, you would end up being sent to the workhouse until such time as you were sent back to your original parish, which might be out in the rural area. And of course, the idea there was that the local people from where you came, if you indeed come from rural areas to the city, would look after you. But of course, that doesn't always happen, especially when you consider other things that were happening across England at the time, notably the Industrial Revolution. So by 1750, which is the height of the period of conflict and engagement of the Royal Navy overseas, when it was most looking for people to work in it, was also a time when the Industrial Revolution was underway, and what that meant for people back home was that the cities were becoming crowded with the construction of factories, and the factory system, of course, was leading to a lot of rural dislocation, because the industries that the factories were carrying out, especially in the textiles, were formerly ones performed by hand by women in rural areas. Of course, a lot of those cottage industries, as we used to call them, virtually closed down overnight. Construction of factories. So all these people were having to come into the cities. The population was booming, and the population of Britain doubled in 100 years, from about 1700 to 1801. Not much in the way of employment prospects for women coming into urban areas, because particularly for rural workers, they were only used to doing rural work. They weren't trained. A lot of them were illiterate. They could certainly speak the language and write rudimentary things, but they weren't sufficiently trained reading and writing to be of any use in domestic service, for instance. So employment was very limited. So why I'm telling you all this is because you can see how there were a lot of push and pull factors working on women that might encourage them to try and, smuggle themselves on board, which is what I'm going to talk about. So you know about the disease problem too, with overcrowding in cities. And then the situation for single women was equally bad, because single women weren't allowed. Well, they weren't able to work in a lot of industries that blokes were able to work in. They weren't allowed to live alone. They had to be living with a male relative, a fairly close male relative. They could own property, but of course that presupposes that you had inherited some property or had somehow or other gained it, and that you were getting income from that. And they could make contracts, but otherwise it was very difficult for women to function independently in the 18th century. Obviously, there were some notable exceptions, but they were by far as I say, the exception. So once again, lots of reasons why women might think, well, hang on, is there a way I can escape this misery on shore and join the Navy? I've mentioned, of course, about wages being low and late for sailors. So that was another complication for married women. So lots of people wanting to, or thinking that they could go to sea, perhaps in disguise. But for some lucky ones, if you were the spouse of certain key officers on board on Navy ships, for instance, the gunner or the carpenter or the boatswain, they were officers who, even when the ship was in port, had to remain on board to keep the ship in a state of readiness for being deployed to a war zone. So the Admiralty fairly early realised that it was reasonable to allow their spouses to work on board Royal Navy, or to come on board to be with their partners on board Navy ships. and they would typically perform, laundry duties, I suppose, keeping uniforms neat and tidy. And in war, they would act as either surgeon's assistants or powder monkeys. These are the people, normally young boys, who were bringing the cartridges of gunpowder up from the ship's magazines to gun decks. It was a very dangerous job. And you're talking about, I think it's 10 pounds each cartridge. 10 in the old money. Somebody could tell me what that is in metric, but 10 and a half pounds roughly in weight for each cartridge that was brought up. So some of the women could be doing those sorts of duties as well, earning their keep. So they were rarely underutilised, the women that did come on board, and because there was always plenty of work to do. And there were others, apart from the wives of some of those special officers, who came on board, well, illicitly, I guess is the best way to describe it. But for people who disguise themselves as blokes, it didn't seem to matter, because the Navy was always short of people, and they were actively recruiting juveniles, especially in waterfront towns like Plymouth and Portsmouth, to fill the ranks. And there was no medical examination. As long as you had a pulse, you were virtually brought on board. And of course, if you think about it from the women's point of view, that those women who weren't in that special class of officers' wives, there was the promise of at least a roof over your head, some food, even some medical care. So you could be in a better situation if you'd stayed on land. Now, Navy regulations generally forbade the presence of women on board ships, but there were some loopholes. There was a proviso that said that the captains could allow women on board if they had orders from superiors, or if, as mentioned previously, that these women were the spouses of services on board. There were other, of course, wives who got smuggled on board on those rare occasions when there were some contacts between the ship's crews and what was going on shore. They sometimes come out in boats and pass themselves off as wives, even though they weren't. Or there were some genuine wives who came out and, shall we say, overstayed their visit to the ship to their spouse. Now, we know about a lot of the situation with some of the officers' wives from a variety of sources, but in our own context in Australia, Matthew Flinders apparently wanted to bring his then new wife, Anne Chappell, with him on the Investigator in 801 until the Admiralty got wind of it and decided to disallow that particular liaison. And of course, tragically, for old Matthew, after he finished his circumnavigation of Australia and the mammoth mapping effort that he undertook, then for all his troubles was imprisoned by the French on Mauritius for, I think it was about 7 years, and finally got back to Anne and didn't live a long time after he left. I think he was gone within 10 years of having returned to England. My memory serves me rightly. So yeah, rather tragic, but an illustration of some of the unfortunate consequences of not having some women on board ship at least. I've mentioned to you about the boatswain, the gunner, the carpenter, and what they could do. For those women who came on board in disguise as blokes, they were just working as ordinary sailors. And and they did all the normal work that ordinary sailors would do, no matter how dangerous. And we even have some record of some of those people because at least 4 of them, there was a person called William Brown, who was a Jamaican lady who became a captain of the foretops. So she was in charge of the crew members who were responsible for operating the sail on the foretop of a sail, of a mast. So you can imagine how responsible that was. We know of 3 others, Hannah Snell, Mary Lacey, Anne Talbot, who had accounts of their experiences as members of the Royal Navy, written by ghost writers, and then they became, in some cases, sort of West End celebrities in trading off their experiences. And we know of other occasional mentions of wives of sailors who had been wounded or were helping in some capacity during wartime on board the Royal Navy ships. And there was one, that's a Joseph Phelan and his wife, who were both killed during a battle on board HMS Swallow in 1812. I suspect that's probably something to do with the war with the 1812 war with America. Their infant child, she'd been working down below as a surgeon's assistant and heard that her husband had been mortally wounded above. And when she went upstairs to see him, she herself was killed, but the infant child that she was carrying survived and was looked after by the sailors until they reached landfall. We don't know the eventual fate of the child, but some sort of hat was passed around. So it was quite, it was a fairly common experience. And there are other illustrations of, or instances of, records of women being involved. There's in the work of ordinary sailors on board Navy ships in that era. This is a portrait painted in what was then the new Houses of Parliament, what we now call the Palace of Westminster, on the bank of the Thames. So it was a mural performed by a guy called Daniel Maclise. And if you look carefully, this is a mural depicting the death of Nelson on board HMS Victory. And of course, there's Nelson in the middle of the portrait. And over here, on the left of the picture, you can see 2 women administering medical assistance to blokes lying there wounded on the deck. All of which indicates that it was fairly common knowledge that women were actively playing different roles on board Navy ships in that era. The gender, of course, of women disguising themselves as blokes was always overlooked by the Navy in short supply of crew. The identity of them was always masked because they would sign on the manifest as blokes. And it was only on the rare occasions of officers' wives being mentioned, or for some other reason, it coming to light that they were, in fact, women disguised as blokes, that any mention was made in official records of them. So we don't know the precise numbers of women involved, but it seems, judging from the popular consciousness of them as depicted by the scene in this painting, plus mentions of them in other contemporary literature, that there must have been quite a few. so their names never entered in muster books. But for instance, Jane Austen, who had two brothers in the Royal Navy, in her book Persuasion, has a conversation between some naval officers about the subject of women in the Navy. So clearly, that they are a thing at the time. Gilbert and Sullivan, no less, celebrate the existence of women on board ship. HMS Pinafore is case in point. And not surprisingly, childbirth at sea was not uncommon on Royal Navy ships. Typically, the women concerned would be taken up to a gun deck, obviously not during battle, because gun decks were typically off bounds for sailors in normal and non-combat situations, and therefore offered more privacy. And the birth would take place somewhere between a couple of cannons. In fact, it's not unknown for ships' guns to be fired, would you believe, to provide a shock to accelerate a birth. I know this sounds far-fetched, but it's true. And there is the revelation that where the paternity of a child was in doubt, it'll be recorded in the ship's manifest that the son of a gun. During the Napoleonic Wars, a Royal Navy captain, W.N. Glascott, wrote in his log at one point that this day, the surgeon informed me that a woman on board had been labouring in childbirth for 12 hours, and if I could see my way to permit the firing of a broadside to leeward, nature would be assisted by the shock. I complied with the request and was delivered with a fine male child. There we are, you have it in writing. All right, so with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, you have what we call the Pax Britannica, the peace for pretty well 100 years. Recruitment decreased in the Navy, impressment died away, and what that meant was that henceforth a lot more care was taken to ensure that Admiralty regulations about not having women on ships were enforced. And that meant that there was proper medical examination of people when they were being recruited, and also the working girl visits that used to happen when ships were visiting ports to be resupplied were eliminated. And of course, the whole mass desertion thing was no longer a problem because ships' crews were allowed to actually go ashore when they came into port, unlike what had been the case when Britain was at war and desertion was a real problem. Pay and tenure improved vastly during the 19th century for British sailors, and there were also some sort of moral crusades that were reflective of what was going on in Victorian society generally, to improve the general moral tone of British society at the time, which led to a sort of purging of even some of the officers' wives from Royal Navy. And by the end of the century, most women had been eliminated from Royal Navy ships altogether, except that we need to mention before we leave this particular era an event that occurred in 1847 with the issuing of the General Naval Service Medal. Now, this was a medal or decoration inaugurated by the government at the time and enthusiastically supported by Victoria and Albert, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And a panel was set up to assess applications for the award of the medal. And a number of women, interestingly, put forward applications and were supported by the panel initially until Buckingham Palace found out about it, and then they were quashed because Victoria in particular had an absolute abhorrence about the idea of women being in the armed forces. But interestingly, there were babies born during the Napoleonic Wars on board Royal Navy ships who, because of their males, were still awarded the medal because they were able to prove that they were on the ship at the time and they weren't women. However, as I mentioned with Gilbert Sullivan and Jane Austen and various paintings, and of course, word on the street, the fact that women had been working, even in the most dangerous circumstances, on board Royal Navy ships throughout the centuries, especially during the 18th and early 19th century, remained in the public consciousness. And there were wider social movements gaining momentum in Britain at the time that would lead eventually to changes to the status of women, even in the armed forces. So in 1884, Britain finally officially established a Royal Navy or Royal Naval Nursing Service, subsequently called the Queen Alexandra Royal Navy Nursing Service, on shore. And by 1914, with war again looming, there appeared to be a lot more done to staff the Royal Navy. The Navy needed desperately, once again, as many people, many blokes as possible to be able to ships. So they set up in 1917, which was a little way into the war, the Wrens, which were established as an auxiliary force. And the idea being to free up as many men as possible from shore jobs by war's end. Something 5,500 women had been enlisted as members of the Women's Royal Navy Service, including 500 of them who were officers. Only one member of the Wrens was killed during the war, which is unfortunate, a lady by the name of Josephine Carr, who actually drowned when the ship that she was embarked on for her first posting, was torpedoed by a German submarine in the Irish Sea. And she was the only Wren killed in First World War, which I guess is not surprising given that they were all based in shore jobs and would only be subject to the normal air raids that people might have suffered in that era, which was not nowhere near as common as later on in World War II. Wrens were disbanded by 1919 after the end of World War I. And interestingly, notwithstanding what the British did with the women in their navy, in Australia there was no equivalent World War I naval arrangement. There were army nurses, but no women in the Royal Australian Navy in World War I. So time passes, and guess what? The late 1930s, the storm clouds are gathering again over Europe, and a pretty amazing woman by the name of Violet Mackenzie, pictured in this photograph on the right hand of your screen, Australia's first woman electrical engineer, realised what was happening, and she had become some years prior very interested in radio telegraphy. She used to run a radio supplies shop in, I think it was the Royal Arcade in Sydney in those days, back in the 30s, and became very interested and engaged in the promotion of radio science and radio telegraphy even, and realised that with war coming, a whole lot of people, particularly in places like the PMG, a lot of blokes would be needed in the armed forces, and there were going to be all these gaps to be filled to operate even like PMG. But she also thought that she could set up a sort of nucleus of people, women who were trained in radio telegraphy, who could operate a trainer-trainer scheme, if you like, for the armed forces. So she set up in very early 30s an organisation called the Civilian Women's Emergency Signalling Corps, the WESC. And then she trained them up in wireless telegraphy to instructional stage, such that by the start of the war, there were 120 women who had achieved that standard. And then contemporaneously, she was negotiating with the Defence Department to assist in whatever way she could with the training of instructors for the armed forces. And in doing that, she had to negotiate with people like Billy Hughes, the then Minister for the Navy, which must have been an interesting exercise given his reputation. Anyway, by the 28th of April 1941, 14 Women's Emergency Signalling Corps members were accepted for civilian naval service and went off to HMAS Harmon in Canberra to do their duty as radio telegraphists. And about 18 months later, these people were offered enlistment and thus became the nucleus of the RANs in the Australian context. The rest of the story we already know, except that in 2019, on International Women's Day, Jennifer Dates, the lady who I began this presentation talking to you about, who had by then attained the rank of captain, was asked to comment on the theme of International Women's Day that year, which was more powerful together. And she said in reply to the question, well, the concept more power together, and of course she was referring to women in armed forces, means we are at our best when men, women and gender diverse people are working together towards the greater outcome. Hard to imagine surgeons, assistants and powder monkeys of Nelson's day agreeing or disagreeing with such an assessment. But that more or less concludes my presentation today, except there is a little short story I need to tell you about concerning arguably the very first woman or female to be enlisted into the Royal Australian Navy. Now, in 2017, the Navy instituted a trophy called First Lady of the Fleet, and it's awarded to the youngest sailor, youngest female sailor on board the oldest ship or the longest serving ship in the Navy on the occasion of the paying off of the previous longest serving Navy ship. If you can follow that. And being called First Lady of the Fleet, it's deliberately a double meaning because it also celebrates the memory of a person by the name of Nancy Bentley. Now, Nancy Bentley was a 6-year-old girl playing on the shores of Port Arthur in Tasmania with some pals, and her family lived nearby. It was in a rural community. It was long since ceased to be a a penal colony, of course, by 1920. And anyway, 1920, she was playing, as I mentioned, with some friends in a field, and she was bitten by a snake, a venomous snake. And her father, in desperation, knowing that the nearest doctor was some miles away, also knew that HMAS Sydney, yes, that HMAS Sydney of Emden fame, was anchored out in the bay near Port Arthur, Carnarvon Bay. So he hurriedly put Nancy in the back of a rowboat and paddled out to the warship and begged the captain for help, because he knew that there would be a doctor on board. So the quick-thinking captain, knowing the rules about not having women on board, decided to enlist her as the ship's mascot. All right. So Nancy Bentley, age 6, became a member of the ship's complement of HMAS Sydney, who was looked after by the ship's surgeon, and then the ship who applied first aid, and then the ship took her down for some observation later on in Hobart Hospital, and then she was duly returned. And Nancy went on to live a very long life, and actually was made an honorary member of the HMAS Sydney Association. And I guess has the honour, and her role in that capacity is celebrated on the trophy itself, of being the first woman of the fleet. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my presentation to you today. I hope you've enjoyed it.